The last time I heard another human laugh, a real laugh, not the brittle, performative kind people force out when they're trying to convince themselves they're still sane, was the morning of September 14th in a coffee shop on Gay Street in Knoxville. A woman at the counter had spilled oat milk across the barista's forearm, and they'd both laughed about it with that effortless, unconscious warmth that only exists when people believe tomorrow is guaranteed. I remember it because I was sitting by the window with a printed topographic map folded under my hands, and I looked up just long enough to watch the moment pass between them. I didn't smile. I was already somewhere else in my mind. I was already up on the ridge, measuring the fall of light through hemlock canopy, calculating how many days of firewood a Carolina winter would demand. 6 weeks later, one of those two people was almost certainly dead. Statistically, probably both. Knoxville fell on the 9th day. I know this because I watched it from 11 miles away and 4,000 feet up, standing on a granite outcrop with a pair of vortex binoculars pressed so hard against my face they left bruises around my eye sockets. The city didn't collapse all at once. It frayed. The lights went out in sections over 3 nights, like a body losing circulation. Extremities first, then the core. On the second night, there was a fire in the old city district that burned unchecked for 14 hours, and I could see it with my naked eyes, a wavering orange glow on the valley floor that looked almost beautiful if you didn't think about what it meant. By the third night, there was nothing. Just a dark shape where a city used to be, and a smell on the wind that didn't belong to any forest. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's the problem with telling this kind of story. The mind wants to jump to the catastrophe, the spectacle, the moment everything broke. But the truth is that the breaking isn't where the story lives. The story lives in the weeks before, when I was carrying 60-pound loads of lumber up a mountainside in the dark, and in the months after, when the silence in those mountains became so total that I started talking to the walls of a cabin I had built with my own hands just to make sure my voice still worked. The story lives in the ordinary space between decisions. The space where you're not fighting for your life, but just sitting with a tin cup of lukewarm stream water, watching fog fill a valley, and wondering whether the person you were before all this would recognize the person you're becoming. My name is Ethan Calloway. I was 38 years old when the world ended, and I had worked for the National Park Service for 11 years, the last 6 stationed in the Great Smoky Mountains. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm not a doomsday prepper. I want to say that clearly because what I did in September, what I built and where I built it, sounds like the actions of someone who had lost touch with reality. But the truth is the opposite. I had been paying closer attention to reality than most people could stomach. 11 years with the Park Service teaches you things that don't make it into the brochures. You learn that infrastructure is thinner than people think, that supply chains are held together by habit more than engineering, that the distance between order and disorder is not a wall, but a membrane. I had watched that membrane stretch during COVID. I had read internal memos about fungal blights in grain stores, antibiotic-resistant infections in livestock populations, water table contamination in 3 southeastern states that never made the national news. None of it pointed to the dead coming back. Nothing pointed to that. What it pointed to was fragility, systemic, structural, bone-deep fragility. And fragility was enough to make me start planning. I found the site 3 years before I built on it, during a backcountry survey in the Hazel Creek watershed. It was on the western slope of an unnamed ridge, about 14 miles from the nearest maintained trail, at roughly 3,900 feet of elevation. The ridge was steep enough on 3 sides to discourage casual hiking, and the 4th side opened onto a drainage choked with rhododendrons so dense you could stand 10 feet from the gap and never know the slope behind it was accessible. The canopy was old growth, red oak, tulip poplar, eastern hemlock, tall enough and thick enough that satellite imagery would show nothing but an unbroken mat of green. There was a spring-fed creek 60 yards downhill. The soil was deep and acidic, good for nothing agricultural, but excellent for drainage, which meant the ground wouldn't turn to mud every time it rained. The wind came predominantly from the west, which mattered for smoke dispersal from a stove. I noted all of this on my first visit, filed it somewhere in the back of my mind, and didn't return for 2 years. When I went back in July, I went with a different kind of attention. I spent 4 days on the ridge, sleeping under a tarp, mapping the topography by hand, measuring the creek's flow at different times of day, cataloging the tree species within a 200-yard radius. I identified sight lines. I identified blind spots. I walked the surrounding terrain in widening circles, looking for game trails, human footprints, old logging roads, anything that might indicate traffic. There was nothing. The place was as close to forgotten as a piece of land can be while still technically existing on a map. I started building on September 7th. I had accumulated 19 days of leave, and I took them all at once. My supervisor, a man named Dan Burkett, who had been managing that district since before I was born, didn't question it. People took leave. It was September. The season was winding down. I told him I was going to visit family, and he told me to enjoy myself, and that was the end of it. The construction was brutally simple and brutally hard. I wasn't building a house. I was building a box, 12 feet by 14 feet, with a low-pitched shed roof, a single door, and one window on the east-facing wall that I could shutter from the inside. The frame was rough-cut lumber that I hauled up in pieces over 6 round trips, each one a 4-hour climb from the nearest point I could reach by truck. The walls were double-layered, exterior boards, a gap stuffed with dried moss and wood shavings for insulation, then interior boards. The roof was corrugated metal panels, 3 of them, covered with a lattice of branches and leaf litter so it wouldn't reflect light or look geometric from above. The floor was raised 8 inches off the ground on log footings to keep moisture out and allow airflow underneath. I installed a small wood stove I had bought used from a man in Maryville who didn't ask questions. The flue ran up through the roof and was capped with a spark arrestor I fabricated from hardware cloth. I positioned the stove against the north wall so the heat would radiate inward, and I split the flue pipe at a 45-degree angle before it exited the roof so that smoke would disperse laterally through the canopy rather than rising in a straight column. This mattered. A vertical plume of smoke in uninhabited wilderness is a signal. A diffused haze through a tree canopy is just weather. The rainwater system was elementary. I ran a gutter along the low edge of the roof into a series of 3 5-gallon food-grade buckets nested on a wooden rack. Each bucket had a screen over the top to catch debris, and the bottom bucket fed through a ceramic gravity filter I had ordered online months earlier and stored in my apartment closet without really admitting to myself why I was buying it. The creek was my primary water source, but the rainwater system was the backup, and in survival, the backup is the thing that actually keeps you alive. For food, I had cache supplies over 3 weeks in August, making trips into the backcountry with a loaded pack every 4 or 5 days. I buried 5-gallon buckets with Gamma Seal lids at 3 separate locations within a 1/4 mile of the cabin site. Rice, dried beans, oats, powdered milk, salt, sugar, coffee, vitamins, a rotating stock of canned protein. Each cache held roughly 3 weeks of calories for one person. Combined with hunting and foraging, I estimated I could sustain myself for 5 to 6 months without resupply. That estimate assumed I was alone. I finished the cabin on September 23rd. I stood in the doorway that evening, smelling fresh-cut wood and wood smoke from the stove's first test burn, and I felt something I have never been able to adequately name. It wasn't pride. It wasn't satisfaction. It was closer to the feeling you get when you lock a door behind you and realize you don't intend to go back through it. A severing. Clean and deliberate and a little bit frightening. I returned to Knoxville. I went back to work. I answered emails and attended a staff meeting about trail maintenance budgets and ate lunch in the break room while someone complained about a parking dispute. And the whole time, some deeper part of me was already living on that ridge, already breathing that air, already counting the days until the membrane finally broke. It broke on October 26th. The first reports were out of Atlanta. A hemorrhagic virus, they said initially, something moving through the homeless population in the downtown shelters. Then it was in Grady Memorial Hospital. Then it was in 3 hospitals. Then the word virus stopped being adequate, because viruses don't make dead people stand up and bite the paramedics trying to bag them. I watched the first cell phone videos on my laptop in my apartment, sitting on the edge of my bed at 2 a.m, and I felt my hands go cold and my vision narrow, and I thought, so this is what it looks like. Not a slow crumble, a detonation. I was on the ridge by October 28th. 41 hours from the first confirmed report to the moment I closed the cabin door behind me, set the crossbar, and sat down on the floor with my back against the wall and my hands shaking in my lap. I had stopped at 3 stores on my way out of Knoxville, not to panic buy because I had already stocked what I needed, but to grab the last things on my list. Antibiotics from a veterinary supply store, a hand-crank emergency radio, extra batteries, 2 rolls of 10 mil plastic sheeting, and a bottle of bourbon that I told myself was for medicinal purposes and knew was for the nights when the mountain got too quiet. Those first days on the ridge were strange. Not frightening, not yet. Strange in the way that a dream is strange when you know you're dreaming but can't wake up. The forest around the cabin was exactly as I had left it. The hemlocks standing in their patient rows, the creek muttering over its rocks, the rhododendron thicket dense and impenetrable below the ridge. Nothing up here had changed. The birds still called at dawn, the squirrels still chattered in the canopy. A black bear passed within 30 yards of the cabin on the second morning, ambling south along the slope with the unhurried confidence of an animal that has never encountered a predator it couldn't outrun. The world at 3,900 feet was functioning exactly as it always had. The catastrophe was a valley problem, a city problem, a down there problem. And for a while, longer than I expected, that distinction held. My days developed a rhythm almost immediately. I woke at first light, which in late October meant around 6:45. I opened the stove, cleared the ash, rebuilt the fire from the coals I had banked the night before. I boiled water for coffee, real coffee, rationed carefully, 1 cup per day, and drank it sitting on the cabin's single step, watching the fog fill the valley below like milk being poured into a bowl. Then I worked. There was always work. Firewood needed splitting and stacking. The water filter needed cleaning. The outhouse I had dug 50 yards downhill needed liming. Game snares needed checking, resetting, relocating. The cabin itself needed constant small repairs. A gap in the chinking where wind whistled through. A hinge that was loosening. A corner of the roof lattice that had shifted in a storm. I hunted in the mornings when I hunted at all. I had a compound bow, quieter than a rifle, and noise discipline was something I thought about constantly, even in those early days. And I was a competent enough shot to take squirrels and rabbits at reasonable distances. I got a turkey in the first week, a big tom that I spotted from 40 yards and dropped clean. I processed it on a flat rock by the creek, saved the feathers for fletching, smoked most of the meat over a low fire that I kept burning for 2 days. The smoked turkey, stored in a sealed bucket in the cool space under the cabin floor, lasted me almost 3 weeks. Each successful hunt extended my timeline, pushed the starvation horizon a little further out, and gave me something to focus on that wasn't the radio. The radio was the hardest part. I listened every night, scanning frequencies with the volume low and my ear close to the speaker. In the first week, there were still official broadcasts, FEMA emergency channels, automated loops from the emergency alert system, a few AM stations that were apparently still staffed by people who had either nowhere to go or too much duty to leave. The news was bad, and then worse, and then incomprehensible. Atlanta was gone. Charlotte was gone. Nashville was under military quarantine, which meant Nashville was gone but hadn't admitted it yet. The infection, and they were still calling it an infection, still using epidemiological language for something that had left epidemiology behind, was spreading faster than any model had predicted, because the models assumed that dead vectors stayed dead. The president addressed the nation on October 30th from an undisclosed location, and his voice had the thin, careful quality of someone reading words he didn't believe from a script someone else had written. 2 days later, there was no address. The frequency carried nothing but a steady, mindless hum. By November 5th, the only human voices left on the radio were amateur operators, ham radio enthusiasts mostly, broadcasting from basements and attics and rooftops, trading information in clipped, urgent bursts. I listened to a man in Asheville describe the barricades on I-240 collapsing. I listened to a woman in Johnson City read a list of names she was looking for. Her children, her mother, a neighbor, repeating them every 15 minutes with the mechanical precision of someone who had passed beyond hope into ritual. I listened to 2 men in Chattanooga argue about whether the infected could swim. One said no. The other said he had watched 6 of them wade across the Tennessee River at Chickamauga Dam without stopping, without surfacing, walking along the riverbed like stones with legs, emerging on the far bank streaming water and still moving. I turned the radio off after that and didn't turn it back on for 4 days. The silence was what I had wanted. I need to be honest about that. When I built the cabin, when I chose this ridge, when I planned every detail of my withdrawal from the world, silence was the goal. Distance was the goal. I had engineered my survival around the principle that other people were the primary variable I couldn't control, and therefore the primary variable I needed to eliminate. And for the first 3 weeks, the silence was everything I had designed it to be. It was clean. It was total. It was mine. I could go entire days without hearing a human sound, including my own voice, and there was a purity in that which I mistook for peace. But silence has weight. I didn't understand this until I was living inside it continuously, the way you don't understand water pressure until you're deep enough for it to press against your chest. By the middle of November, I had stopped speaking entirely. Not as a decision, but as an erosion. I would go to say something, a muttered comment to myself while splitting wood, or a reflexive curse when I nicked my thumb with a knife, and the sound would die in my throat. Not because I suppressed it, but because the silence around me had become so massive and so structural that breaking it felt like vandalism, like throwing a rock through a cathedral window. The silence wasn't just the absence of noise, it was a presence, a thing with density and texture, and it was slowly replacing the parts of me that used to need other people. I started keeping a journal on November 18th. Not because I wanted to document anything, but because I needed proof that my thoughts still had sequence. I would read my entries back to myself at night by the stove light, and sometimes the handwriting looked unfamiliar, and sometimes the observations seemed to belong to someone calmer and more certain than I felt. I wrote about weather. I wrote about game patterns. I wrote about the way the light changed on the ridge as the canopy thinned with the season. I did not write about Knoxville. I did not write about Caroline, my sister, who I had not been able to reach since October 29th, and who was probably dead in a suburb of Columbus where the houses all looked the same and none of them were built to keep anything out. I did not write about the nights when I woke at 3 in the morning with my heart hammering and lay in the dark listening for sounds that weren't there. Or the nights when the sounds were there, distant, indistinct, but present, moving through the forest below the ridge with a slowness that didn't belong to any animal I knew. The first one I saw was on November 22nd. I was checking a snare line along the creek when I noticed the smell. It was wrong. Not the clean decay of leaf litter or the sharp musk of a bear, but something thicker, sweeter, more chemical. Like meat left in a closed car in August. I froze. I didn't breathe. I crouched behind a deadfall log and waited, and after maybe 2 minutes, I saw it come through the rhododendron on the far side of the creek, maybe 40 yards away. It had been a man. That was still visible in the general architecture. The height, the shoulder width, the remnants of clothing that hung from it in strips. But everything that had made it a man was gone. The skin was the color of a wet grocery bag, gray-green and slack, and it moved with a gait that I can only describe as solved. Not stumbling, not shambling, not the Hollywood lurch. It moved the way water moves through a crack, finding the path of least resistance with a mindless, mechanical efficiency that was worse than aggression because aggression implies intent. And this thing had no intent. It had only direction. It was moving south along the creek, not following anything, not hunting, just going. And its head swiveled in slow, continuous arcs, like a radar dish scanning for a signal it couldn't define. It didn't see me. It didn't smell me. The wind was in my face, and I was downhill and motionless, and it passed within 30 yards of my position and continued south without pausing. I stayed behind that log for 45 minutes after it disappeared. When I finally stood, my legs were shaking so badly I had to hold onto a tree. I went back to the cabin, barred the door, and sat on my bunk with the bow across my knees until dark. That night, I made a decision that I think saved my life, but cost me something I can't get back. I decided that the cabin's concealment was now its only defense, and that concealment meant absolute discipline. No fires during the day, when smoke might be visible against the canopy. No movement on exposed ground during daylight hours. No noise above a whisper, ever, for any reason. I would become a feature of the landscape, still, silent, invisible. I would survive by ceasing to behave like a living thing. And I did. For weeks I did. December came and the mountains turned brutal. Temperatures dropped into the teens at night, and I burned my stove only between sunset and the early hours of the morning, when the smoke would be invisible against the dark sky and the cold air would press it down through the canopy rather than letting it rise. I moved like a ghost on my own ridge. I ate cold food during the day, handfuls of oats soaked in creek water, strips of jerky I had smoked in the first weeks, canned beans eaten straight from the tin with a spoon I never let clink against the metal. I rationed everything. I shrank my footprint to almost nothing, and the silence, which had been heavy before, became absolute. It was in the second week of December that I first heard the voice. I was lying in my bunk in the dark, not sleeping, just existing in that gray space between consciousness and nothing, when I heard someone say my name. Not outside, not in the forest, inside the cabin. Close, like someone leaning over my bunk and speaking directly into my ear. Ethan. Clear as a bell. My father's voice, which was impossible because my father had been dead for 7 years. I sat up so fast I hit my head on the low ceiling. The cabin was empty. The door was barred. The window was shuttered. There was nothing, no one, and the silence rushed back in to fill the space where the voice had been. And I sat there in the dark with my hand on my chest, feeling my heart try to break through my ribs. And I understood for the first time that the mountain was doing something to me that I hadn't planned for. I had prepared for hunger. I had prepared for cold, for injury, for the infected. I had not prepared for what total isolation does to the human mind when it goes on long enough. After that night, I started talking to myself deliberately. Forced conversations. I would narrate my actions while I worked. Now I'm splitting the kindling. Now I'm checking the filter. Now I'm walking to the snare line. Like a children's television host performing for an audience of trees. It felt ridiculous. It felt necessary. The sound of my own voice in that silence was thin and unconvincing, like a single candle in a warehouse. But it was something. It was proof that I was still a person, and not just a survival system operating on routine. Christmas Day came, and I opened a can of peaches I had been saving. I ate them sitting on my step in weak winter sunlight, and the syrup was so sweet it made my teeth ache, and I cried for the first time since the outbreak. Not for long, maybe 2 minutes. Then I wiped my face, washed the can in the creek, and crushed it flat for the scrap metal pile. Grief was a luxury I couldn't afford to indulge, but I could afford 2 minutes. That felt like a fair exchange. The second infected came in late December, then 2 more in early January. They moved through the lower elevations without pattern or purpose, solitary figures drifting along the creek drainages like leaves caught in a current. None of them climbed the ridge. None of them came close to the cabin. But their presence below me was a constant low-grade pressure, like a sound just below the threshold of hearing that you can't identify, but can't ignore. I marked their passages in my journal. Dates, times, directions of travel. I was looking for patterns, and there were none, which was somehow worse than a pattern would have been. In mid-January, the pattern changed. Not with the infected, with the living. I was on the outcrop, where I sometimes went to observe the valley. My high point, my lookout. When I saw movement on the old logging road 4 miles below. Not the mechanical drift of the infected. This was purposeful, erratic, human. I raised the binoculars and saw 2 figures moving uphill through the bare hardwoods, one supporting the other. They were carrying packs. The one being supported was limping badly, and even from that distance I could see the dark stain on their left leg. I watched them for an hour. They stopped frequently. The injured one sat down each time with the careful, controlled lowering of someone managing serious pain. The other one, smaller, quicker, probably female, moved in circles around each rest stop, scanning the woods, never sitting, never still. They were heading generally north, toward the higher elevations, and their trajectory, if maintained, would bring them within 2 miles of my ridge. I went back to the cabin and sat on my bunk, and had the first genuine argument with myself that I can remember having. The logic was simple and merciless. 2 people meant twice the resource consumption. 2 people meant noise, meant movement, meant a larger footprint, meant discovery. The injured one would need care, which meant supplies I couldn't replace. And there was no guarantee they were safe. Not from infection, not from desperation, not from the simple human capacity to take what they needed by force if asking didn't work. Every principle I had built my survival around said the same thing. Stay hidden, stay silent, stay alone. But I kept seeing the smaller figure circling those rest stops, scanning the trees, never sitting, never still. And I recognized something in that restless vigilance that I couldn't argue away. Because it was the same thing I saw in myself every morning when I stepped outside and checked the tree line before I took a breath. It was the look of someone carrying more weight than they were built for, and carrying it anyway, because there was no one else to hand it to. I didn't go to them. I need to be clear about that. I didn't have some cinematic change of heart and rush down the mountain with open arms. What I did was leave a cache. I took one of my buried supply buckets, the middle one, 3 weeks of calories, and I relocated it to a rock overhang near the logging road, a spot they would pass if they kept their current heading. I left it visible, but not obvious. A test. If they found it, they'd eat. If they didn't, I hadn't lost much. And either way, I hadn't revealed myself. They found it. I know because I checked the site 2 days later, and the bucket was empty, cleaned, and placed upright with a piece of birch bark laid on top. On the bark, someone had written in charcoal, "Thank you. God bless." I stared at those words for a long time. Then I went back to the cabin and tried to pretend that nothing had changed. Everything had changed. Their names were Dana and Marcus. I learned this 5 days later when I found them camped under a tarp lean-to about 1.5 miles below my ridge on a flat bench near the creek. I didn't introduce myself. I watched them for most of a day from a concealed position uphill, studying their camp, their behavior, their patterns. Marcus was the injured one, a heavy-set black man in his early 50s with a badly infected gash on his left calf that he kept wrapped in strips of cloth. Dana was younger, early 30s, white, with short dark hair and the kind of angular, watchful face that never seemed to rest. She did everything: gathered wood, boiled water, checked the perimeter, redressed Marcus's wound. He directed her from where he sat propped against a tree, pointing, gesturing, occasionally shaking his head. They had the dynamic of people who hadn't known each other long, but had been through something together that had compressed months of familiarity into days. I showed myself on the morning of the second day. I stepped out of the tree line 40 yards from their camp with my hands visible and my bow unstrung and slung over my shoulder. Dana saw me first. She was on her feet with a hatchet in her hand before I could blink, and she put herself between me and Marcus with a speed and decisiveness that told me she had done this before. "I left the bucket," I said. Those were the first words I had spoken to another human being in 83 days. My voice sounded like something scraped out of a drain pipe. Dana didn't lower the hatchet. "Who are you?" "Ethan. I have a camp uphill. I've been up here since October." "Alone?" "Yes." She looked at me for a long time. I don't know what she was calculating. Threat assessment, probably. The same invisible arithmetic I had been running on her for 2 days. Then she lowered the hatchet, not all the way, but enough. "His leg is infected," she said. "Not bitten. He fell through a porch in Bryson City 3 weeks ago. Rusted nail. It's getting worse." I looked at Marcus. He looked back at me with dark, steady eyes and said nothing. He was sweating despite the cold, which was a bad sign. "I have antibiotics," I said. "Veterinary grade. Fish amoxicillin. Same compound, different label." Dana's face did something complicated. "What do you want for them?" "Nothing. But I can't bring you to my camp." "I didn't ask to come to your camp." "I know. I'm telling you anyway." I gave them the antibiotics that afternoon. A 10-day course of amoxicillin and a bottle of iodine for wound irrigation. I showed Dana how to clean and repack the wound, which she absorbed with focused, efficient attention. Marcus, when I finally got close enough to examine his leg, looked at me and said, "Your Park Service." Not a question. "Was," I said. "I can tell. You move like someone who knows this terrain." "I've been here a while." "Longer than the outbreak?" I didn't answer that. I cleaned his wound, left the supplies, and went back up to my ridge. I told myself that was the end of it, a clean transaction, Antibiotics for silence. They would heal, they would move on, and I would return to my practiced invisibility. But I went back 3 days later to check Marcus's leg, and then 2 days after that. And then I stopped pretending I was going back for medical reasons and admitted that I was going back because something in me was starving in a way that cached rice and smoked turkey couldn't fix. Dana, in her terse and efficient way, had started asking me questions about the terrain, about water sources, about game patterns, and I found myself answering at length. Not because the questions required it, but because forming complex sentences and watching another person receive them felt like drinking water after a drought I hadn't fully registered. Marcus healed slowly. The antibiotics worked, but 3 weeks of untreated infection had done damage, and his mobility was limited. By early February, it was clear they weren't moving on anytime soon. And by then, 3 more people had found the mountains. The first was a man named Garrett, lean and silent, who arrived from the east carrying a deer rifle and nothing else. He was in his early 60s, a retired electrician from Waynesville, and he had walked for 9 days through the backcountry after his neighborhood was overrun. He didn't ask for help. He built his own shelter, a surprisingly competent debris hut, a half-mile south of Dana and Marcus's camp, and he kept to himself with a discipline that I recognized and respected. But he was there, and his presence on the ridge was another variable, another point on a map that was getting crowded. Then came the Porters, a married couple, Jay and Elena, both in their 40s, former school teachers from Sevierville. They arrived in worse shape than anyone so far. Thin, frightened, carrying their supplies in garbage bags. Elena had a cough that wouldn't quit, and Jay had the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had seen something he couldn't process and had shelved the processing for later. They had followed the creek uphill on nothing but the theory that higher ground meant safety, and they had stumbled onto Dana's camp by accident. I found out about the Porters when Dana hiked up to my ridge, the first time anyone had come to me rather than the other way around, and stood at the edge of my clearing with her hands in her pockets and said, "We have a problem." I knew what the problem was. The problem was math. 5 people in a drainage that I had provisioned for 1. 5 people making noise, making smoke, making trails through the underbrush that any decent tracker, living or otherwise, could follow. 5 people with needs I hadn't planned for and couldn't meet without depleting reserves that were already finite. "They can't stay in your camp," I said. "I know. They need their own site, away from you, away from me, spread out, dispersed footprint." Dana nodded. "That's what I was thinking, but they don't know how. Jay can barely start a fire. Elena's sick." "What are you asking me?" She looked at me the way she had looked at me the first day, calculating, assessing, running numbers behind her eyes. "I'm asking you to teach them. I'm asking you to help me keep these people alive without getting us all killed." I didn't say yes. Not immediately. I sat with it for a full day, turning it over like a stone in my hand, examining every facet. The risk was real. More people meant more visibility, more noise, more resource pressure, more points of failure. Every survivor who joined this accidental cluster was another thread connecting my hidden cabin to the wider world, and enough threads would form a rope that could pull everything down. I had built my survival on invisibility. What Dana was asking me to do was become visible. But she was right about one thing. Jay and Elena would die without help. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the slow, grinding inevitability of people who lack the skills to sustain themselves in mountain wilderness in winter. And if they died, they might not stay dead. And if they didn't stay dead, they would wander. And if they wandered, they might wander uphill. It was still math. It was just different math. I started teaching the Porters the next day. I showed Jay how to split wood efficiently, how to bank a fire so it lasted through the night, how to build the Dakota fire hole that burned hot with minimal smoke. I showed Elena how to filter water, how to set a snare, how to identify the winter-persistent plants that were edible or medicinal. Birch bark for tea, slippery elm for her cough, witch hazel for antiseptic. They were eager, desperate to learn, and they absorbed instruction with the intensity of people who understood that the knowledge I was giving them was the only thing standing between them and a slow death by exposure or starvation. I set them up in a site 3/4 of a mile from my cabin, in a protected hollow with good drainage and a southern exposure that would catch the weak winter sun. I helped them build a shelter, nothing as permanent as my cabin, but solid enough to keep out wind and rain. I gave them supplies from my middle cache, which was now nearly empty, and I tried not to calculate the number of days those calories represented when I divided them by 3. Something was happening on the ridge that I hadn't anticipated and couldn't fully control. The 5 of us, me, Dana, Marcus, Garrett, the Porters, had become a network. Not a community, not yet, but a system of mutual awareness that functioned almost like an organism. Garrett, from his position to the south, served as an early warning system for anything moving up from the lower elevations. Dana and Marcus, in the middle, were the hub of information. People checked in with them, shared observations, traded small supplies. The Porters, once they stabilized, contributed labor and a relentless, school-teacher optimism that I found irritating and necessary in equal measure. And I, whether I liked it or not, had become the person people looked to when decisions needed to be made. I didn't want leadership. I want to be honest about that. Leadership implies responsibility for outcomes you can't guarantee, and I had spent months reducing my exposure to variables I couldn't control. But the logic was inescapable. I knew the terrain better than anyone. I had the most supplies, the most skills, the most secure position. When Garrett wanted to know whether a particular slope was safe to hunt, he asked me. When Dana needed to know if the creek water was reliable after a heavy rain, she asked me. When Jay and Elena had a question about literally anything, they asked me. The questions accumulated, and each answer I gave bound me a little tighter to these people, and each binding made me a little less invisible and a little more necessary. By late February, 2 more survivors had arrived. A young woman named Kira, barely 20, who had walked alone from Gatlinburg with a backpack full of canned soup and a fixed-blade knife she clearly didn't know how to use. And an older man named Tom Shelby, a former Marine in his late 60s who arrived with a rucksack, a sidearm, and the terrifying calm of someone who had made peace with dying a long time ago, and was only mildly surprised to still be doing it. Tom changed things. Not because he was dangerous, though he was, unambiguously, the most dangerous person on the ridge, but because he introduced a concept I had been avoiding: organization. Within 3 days of his arrival, he had walked every camp, assessed every person's strengths and deficits, mapped the sight lines and choke points of the drainage, and proposed a watch rotation that covered the 4 most likely approaches to our cluster. He didn't propose this to me. He proposed it to everyone, standing in Dana and Marcus's camp with the easy authority of someone who had commanded attention his whole life and saw no reason to stop. "You've got 7 people on this mountain," he said. "That's enough to hold a position or enough to lose one. Depends on whether you act like a group or a collection of individuals waiting to get picked off." I resented him immediately. I resented his competence, his clarity, his assumption that our situation called for military thinking. I resented how quickly everyone else responded to it, how Dana nodded, how Garrett straightened up, how even Marcus, still limping, seemed to solidify in the presence of someone who spoke in certainties rather than calculations. But I couldn't argue with his logic. because his logic was right. We were exposed. We were uncoordinated. We were 7 people pretending that proximity wasn't interdependence, and the pretending was going to get someone killed. So we organized. Not formally, not with titles or hierarchy, but with structure. Tom and Garrett took primary watch duties, alternating 12-hour shifts on the southern and eastern approaches. Dana managed supply inventory and rationing, which she did with a ruthless precision that no one enjoyed and everyone respected. Marcus, whose leg had healed enough for limited mobility, began processing and preserving game. Jay and Elena maintained the camps, repairs, firewood, water. Kira, who turned out to be far tougher and more resourceful than her initial appearance suggested, became our forager, learning the forest with an eagerness that reminded me of my early years in the Park Service. And I became the person in the cabin on the ridge, the one who made the decisions that no one else wanted to make. The first hard decision came in March. A family appeared on the logging road. A man, a woman, 2 children under 10. They were in terrible shape. The man was gaunt and hollow-eyed. The woman carried the younger child on her back, and the child wasn't moving. The older child walked beside them, with the silent, mechanical gait of a kid who had stopped processing what was happening around them. Dana brought me the news. I climbed to the outcrop with the binoculars and watched them for 20 minutes. The woman sat down in the road and didn't get up. The man stood over her, looking around at the forest with the expression of someone who had run out of options and was waiting for the landscape to provide one. "We can't take 4 more people," I said. Dana didn't argue. She just looked at me. "We're already past sustainable. The caches are gone. We're living on what we hunt and forage, and that's not enough for 7. 11 is impossible." "The child on her back hasn't moved." "I know. Ethan." "I know." I went down the mountain. I went alone. I brought food, 3 days' worth, which was more than I should have given, and I brought a map I had drawn by hand, showing an alternate route over the ridge to the west, where there was a series of summer cabins along a Forest Service road that might still have supplies. I gave them the food and the map, and I told them they couldn't come up the ridge. The man looked at me with an expression that I still see when I close my eyes. Not anger, not even betrayal, but a kind of exhausted recognition, as if he had already known this was how it would go and was simply watching it happen. The woman didn't look at me at all. The child on her back was alive but feverish, and I gave them children's Tylenol from my dwindling medical supplies and showed the man how to keep her hydrated with small sips. They left the next morning. I watched them through the binoculars, heading west along the route I had drawn. They moved slowly. The older child held the man's hand. I watched them until they disappeared into the tree line, and then I sat on the outcrop for a long time, and I didn't write in my journal that night. The group didn't talk about it. Nobody asked me what I had done. I think Dana told them, in her quiet way, and I think they all understood. And I think they all felt the same thing I felt, which was relief and guilt in equal measure, and the understanding that those 2 feelings would now be permanent residents in whatever was left of our moral architecture. Spring came slowly to the Smokies. The rhododendron bloomed in April, explosions of pink and white against the dark green understory, and the forest floor erupted with trillium and bloodroot and jack-in-the-pulpit. The canopy filled in, which improved our concealment but reduced our sightlines. The creek swelled with snowmelt and rain, and the sound of water became a constant backdrop that masked smaller noises and made watch duty harder. Game became more plentiful: rabbits, squirrels, turkey, the occasional deer, and for the first time since winter, we were eating close to enough. But the spring also brought the infected. As the snow melted at lower elevations, they began moving uphill in greater numbers, following the creek drainages like salmon in reverse. Garrett counted 11 in a single week passing through the lower valley. Most were solitary, but twice we spotted groups, 3, then 5, moving together with that terrible synchronized drift that suggested some form of communication or attraction we didn't understand. They didn't climb to our elevation, not yet. But the trend was clear, and the trend was upward. Tom proposed a perimeter. Not a wall, we didn't have the materials or the manpower, but a system of early warning devices, tripwires with tin cans, deadfall traps on the most accessible trails, brush barriers across natural pathways. It was low-tech and imperfect, but it gave us notice, and notice gave us time, and time was the only advantage we had. We built the perimeter in 2 weeks. It was exhausting, physical work that left everyone sore and short-tempered, and it forced us into closer contact than we'd had since the group formed. Arguments became more frequent. Garrett and Tom clashed over the placement of tripwires. Jay, who had grown quieter and more withdrawn since winter, snapped at Elena over something trivial, and then didn't speak for 2 days. Marcus and Dana had a disagreement about rationing that escalated until Marcus said something about leadership being assumed rather than earned, and Dana walked away without responding and didn't come back to camp until the next morning. I watched these fractures with the detached attention of someone cataloging weather patterns. They were inevitable. 7 people living in close proximity, under constant stress with no privacy, no entertainment, no relief from the grinding dailiness of survival. Of course they fought. Of course the small resentments accumulated. The miracle wasn't that we had conflict. The miracle was that the conflict hadn't torn us apart yet. What held us together, I think, was the work. Not the emotional labor of community. We were all too tired and too guarded for that. But the physical labor of staying alive. There is something about splitting wood alongside someone that bypasses the need for trust. You don't have to like the person handing you kindling. You just have to acknowledge that you're both cold. The shared vulnerability of our situation created a bond that wasn't affection or loyalty or friendship, but something more primitive and more durable. The bond of people who are all equally screwed and know it. By May, I had been on the mountain for 7 months. I had entered the forest as one man and become something else entirely. Not better, not worse, but fundamentally rearranged. The Ethan Calloway who had carried lumber up this ridge in September had been a man with a plan. A man who believed that survival was an engineering problem with an engineering solution. Build the right structure, cache the right supplies, eliminate the right variables. Stay hidden, stay silent, stay alone, and the math would work out. That man was logical and thorough, and he was also, I can see now, profoundly wrong. Not about the logistics, but about the premise. He had assumed that survival was the point, that living through the catastrophe was the same as living. It wasn't. I know that now. Survival without context is just metabolism, a heart beating in a box. I had spent months reducing myself to pure function, calories in, calories out, threat assessment, resource management. And what I had produced was not a life, but a system, elegant and self-sustaining and completely empty. The people on this ridge, with all their noise and need and infuriating unpredictability, had broken that system open, and what had poured in was something I had no protocol for. Not happiness, nothing so simple. More like consequence. More like the weight of being known. Dana came to my cabin one evening in late May, something she rarely did. She sat on the step next to me, and we watched the valley darken. And after a long silence, she said, "Do you ever think about leaving?" Leaving the mountain? Leaving all of it. Just walking north until you hit Canada. Starting over somewhere with nobody who needs you. I thought about it honestly. Every day. But you don't. No. Why? I didn't have an answer that sounded right. I could have said duty. I could have said responsibility. I could have said that the math of mutual survival was better than the math of solitary survival. Which was true, but wasn't the reason. The reason was harder and simpler than any of those things. The reason was that I had heard Dana laugh once. A real laugh. Startled out of her by something Kira had said while they were gutting a rabbit. An absurd and unrepeatable joke that caught Dana off guard and produced a sound so genuine and unguarded that it stopped me in my tracks from 50 yards away. And I had stood there in the trees, listening to that laugh, and I had thought of the coffee shop on Gay Street, the woman and the barista and the spilled oat milk, and I had understood that this sound, this stupid, unreproducible human sound, was the thing I had built my cabin to survive without. And it was the thing that made survival worth the effort. I didn't say any of that to Dana. I said, "Because I'm not finished here." She nodded, as if that were enough. And maybe it was. Maybe the explanations we owe each other are smaller than we think. The cabin is still standing. It's June now, and the Smokies are in full summer green, the canopy so thick that the forest floor exists in a permanent twilight that smells like loam and rain and growing things. We are 9 people. 2 more arrived in May, a pair of brothers from Maggie Valley who brought with them, improbably, a bag of seed potatoes and the knowledge of how to grow them. We have a garden now, a small cleared patch on a south-facing slope that Dana guards with the same intensity she brings to everything. We have a watch rotation that runs like clockwork. We have a system for processing game, a system for water purification, a system for waste management. We have structure. We also have fear and exhaustion and grief that surfaces at unpredictable moments and swamps whoever it catches. We have arguments that don't resolve and resentments that calcify and long silences between people who are too tired to bridge them. We have the ongoing, never-diminishing threat below us, the infected moving through the valleys in numbers that increase as the months pass, pressing uphill with the slow, implacable pressure of a rising tide. We have no illusion that this ridge is permanent, no fantasy that 700 vertical feet of mountain will protect us forever. We are, all of us, living on borrowed elevation, and we know it. But here is the thing I have learned on this mountain. The thing I couldn't have learned alone in a cabin, no matter how many years I survived there. The value of a life is not determined by its security. It is determined by its entanglement. Every person who arrived on this ridge made me less safe and more alive. Every mouth I fed reduced my margin and expanded my reason for maintaining one. This is not a paradox. It is the plain, unarguable math of being human. And I was an idiot for ever thinking I could engineer my way around it. The cabin I built in September still stands at the top of the ridge, hidden under its lattice of branches and leaf litter, invisible from below and almost invisible from 10 feet away. I still sleep there most nights. I still bar the door, still listen to the silence before I close my eyes. But the silence is different now. It's not empty. It's populated. It holds the sound of Dana sharpening a knife, and Marcus humming some tuneless song while he smokes meat over the fire pit, and Kira asking Garrett to teach her to shoot, and the Porter kids, because Elena was pregnant, it turned out, and the baby came in April, a girl they named Haven, and her crying at night carries across the ridge like a signal fire that I should resent for the danger it represents and instead receive like music. I built a hidden cabin deep in the Smoky Mountains weeks before the zombie outbreak, and it saved my life. But it was not the cabin that kept me alive. It was the failure of everything the cabin was designed to do. Keep people out, keep me hidden, keep the world at a distance, that turned survival into something I could bear. The mountains are quiet tonight. The stove is warm. The door is barred but not locked, because locks imply a permanence we don't have, and a fear I'm trying to outgrow. Somewhere below the ridge, in the dark valleys where the dead walk without purpose or rest, the world that was is still ending. Up here, in the fragile, temporary, entangled mess of this accidental community, something else is beginning. I don't know what to call it yet, but I'm staying long enough to find out.